Hello, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk today about the potential risks that we have for 2021 in terms of insects. And I think the big one for us in Ontario will be corn rootworm and the Bt resistant issue. So if you're a grower who is not sure if they have resistance yet, I at least want you to pay attention to signs of resistance and notify your seed provider if you do see anything, as well as myself, but also those who suspect they have resistance, to take some actions to try and help mitigate it, because we really do need to try and maintain or reset some of this issue to help the Bt hybrids succeed going forward, because we really don't have other options coming. So there are two different types of rootworm here in Ontario, both the western corn rootworm and the northern corn rootworm. And both of them are very resilient. If we continue to use the same management tool on them, they have developed resistance or adapted to it. So that includes rotation. In areas where they used foliar insecticides quite a lot, they've developed resistance. And now in the case of us, almost solely relying on Bt hybrids as management tool, they are starting to develop resistance to that. There is one generation per year, and you can see the adults, which are the most obvious, come out around August and hang out in fields until a very hard frost. We saw them out until late October, early November in Ontario in 2020. These adults mate and they lay their eggs in soil, and those eggs that are laid into a field that goes into corn will allow the larvae to survive. So we start to see those eggs hatch somewhere in June, and the larvae start feeding on roots. And as I mentioned, if you don't plant corn in that field, the larvae will die. So that's one of the best management tools against rootworm. But unfortunately, we've learned that those adults and those larvae that develop resistance to Bt take longer to come out as adults. And unfortunately, that increases our risk of resistance, because only Bt survivors will be merging later and mating with each other and not getting an opportunity to mate with individuals that are still tolerant or are still susceptible to Bt, and can kind of dilute those resistant genes. But the best way to know if you need rootworm protection, if corn is going into that field, is to monitor in August. And if you see one beetle per plant during that time, it's a good indication that the next year's corn will need protection, either with soil insecticides, Bt, or just rotate. Most of those adults do lay eggs in cornfields, so we tend to see populations build much more in 3 or more years of corn after corn. As I said, the larvae exclusively feed on corn roots, and they clip them and cause a reduction in nutrient uptake to the plants. And eventually, if you have a windstorm, you'll see crop lodging. And that's a big issue when it comes to silage corn in particular, because those plants become unharvestable as they touch the ground, and you risk contamination. But you can see anywhere from 10 to 50% yield loss due to this clipping from root. So how did we get here? Well, we are about where the US was in 2013. So originally, the very first events that came out only had one cry protein in them targeting rootworms, and that was back in 2003. And slowly over time, these single trait hybrids were registered. And as you can see, field resistance evolved quicker over time. And now we have, in the US, they have had field resistance to all of the different proteins. The real issue is multiple reasons. These proteins are low to moderate dose at best. And because they came out as single traits, the beetles were exposed to them first and overcame them. So when we started pyramid hybrids to have 2 of the Bt proteins in one hybrid, they were already able to overcome that protein. And in particular, because 3 of the 4 proteins are very closely related, they have very similar modes of action. So even if the population wasn't exposed to one of the one or two of the proteins before, they could already overcome them simply because they were first exposed to one protein and overcame it. So it's not a matter of just switching proteins or hybrids over once you start to see resistance develop, because then it's just increasing the chance of resistance or them overcoming those hybrids too. Here in Ontario, we had some isolated resistant cases, but very few until the last few years when we started to see more reports. And this is just one field of many. We know of reports from Huron, Perth, and Durham counties this year, though those are the only ones that came to us as at Omafra to know about, or even that were so obvious that there were signs of clear resistance happening. But here in this case, this was a field in Blythe's second year silage field in 2020. The field across the road that was owned by a different grower had a resistant issue in 2019. He did due diligence and rotated out of that field for 2020 and planted soybeans. However, the adults that came from 2019's corn obviously laid their eggs in this field across the way as well, so that when this grower in 2020 planted corn, he was significantly hit. And what's interesting about this scenario is that between those two fields, those hybrids were two different hybrids, and they shared only one Bt protein in common, meaning that between the pairs of proteins that were in each of these fields, 3 of the 4 proteins were compromised. And this is just one example. We know Brussels area and other regions saw multiple fields showing signs of resistance and requiring testing to be done. We do have single traits still on the landscape, and that does increase our risk of resistance. As I mentioned, when the insect is able to overcome one of the proteins, it can easily overcome the other protein that might be paired with it in a pyramid hybrid. And we know too that if they can develop resistance within 3 years of being exposed to a single trait. They are pyramid hybrids as well, and you may be familiar with these trade names. But again, unfortunately, because we're starting to see resistance to at least 3 of the 4 proteins here in Ontario, there's very few, if any, that are still functioning pyramids, meaning both cries work on against the insect, or even in some cases, there may only be single trait hybrids now, or no functioning cries at all in these hybrids. So unfortunately, there's no going back to resetting the population to be not resistant or not be able to overcome these proteins. So how did we get here? Well, the last few years have been really ideal for corn rootworm, just weather-wise, but also Bt rootworm hybrids have been so good at managing rootworm that it's enabled us to do continuous corn in a broad landscape of Ontario. So as I mentioned, as you grow corn continuously in the same field, you really build up those populations. And these beetles can travel. They hop back and forth, and they can be carried by wind. So neighbors are sharing with neighbors when it comes to this pest. So unfortunately, in an area where there's widespread continuous corn, you can really build up a significant population of rootworm. When simply, if many of those fields were rotated out of corn for a year or two, we would see a complete wipeout of the rootworm population to be much more lower levels and much more manageable levels. So where do we go? As I mentioned, resistance will always now be within the rootworm populations, but what we need to do is knock back these populations to lower levels. So those individuals that are able to overcome the Bt are fewer in that population, and so you won't see as much damage. So this is our best way to reestablish the durability of these rootworm hybrids is to rotate out of corn for at least 1 year, but preferably 2. So if you can't rotate out of corn because of your livestock production, consider swapping land with a cash cropper that has a good 3-year corn or crop rotation, where as long as corn wasn't planted in the previous year, you wouldn't even have to use Bt hybrids in that field. And as I mentioned, it would be ideal for us to be rotating for 2 years in a row, because in these heavy continuous corn areas, you see wall-to-wall corn. And so 1 or 2 fields being rotated out of the host crop really isn't going to make as much of a difference as it would if more of those fields follow the same pattern of going out of corn. And I strongly discourage the thinking about around just switching pyramid hybrids, because as I showed you in that list, there are very few hybrids that are still going to be a functioning hybrid or functioning pyramid hybrid in the different traits that we have. So here's just that visual of why rotation out of corn for the next few years is important. So if you had corn in 2020 and a few of the beetles actually were resistant, they would have laid eggs in that field. But if you plant a non-host crop like soybeans, all of those larvae will die. However, if there's a lot of corn still in the area, adults could potentially lay their eggs in that soybean field and continue that population. So if you have a second year of non-corn, there's really going to be much fewer adults still available in the area, and then you will see a significant drop in the populations. If you're a livestock producer and really don't know how or what to switch from for corn, we do have resources on Field Crop News. My forage and grazing specialist, Christine O'Reilly, has and Joanna Follings has put together resources for switching to cereals for high moisture corn, as well as silage replacements. And we also have a webinar that's been posted on Field Crop News exclusively or more directed towards cattle sector, to talk with the nutrient specialists and livestock specialists about these options. So I do encourage you to take a look on Field Crop News. If you can't rotate from corn, away from corn, then use an above ground BT, one that's targeting Western bean cutworm or European corn borer instead, and then use root protection either through a liquid or granular soil insecticide, or through high rate seed treatment to give that protection. And that way the adults and larvae are not being exposed to rootworm BT and continuing that evolution of resistance. There's also opportunity with biocontrol nematodes, so feel free to contact me if you find interest in that avenue, because I see great potential in helping mitigate this issue through these biocontrol nematodes. Any above ground hybrid that you use, though, I don't want you to just exclusively start to use it with soil insecticides going forward, because again, we want to rotate these management tools, and we would risk developing resistance for Western bean cutworm if we're all using BIP products all the time across the landscape. So please choose wisely and rotate these management tools accordingly, both with crop rotation, above ground hybrids, plus seed or soil insecticide, and then BT rootworm hybrids when you really need it. Less ideal would be switching to another rootworm pyramid hybrid, because this continues to expose the population. And if you do that, certainly you may risk masking resistant cases. And do not use soil insecticides or seed treatments with these products, because that actually helps speed up resistance. But also let us know if you do see resistance or signs of rootworm resistance happening in your field. A more sustainable approach, once we get past these next few years of trying to knock back the rootworm population, is to really make sure that we're rotating out of corn more frequently, at least every 4 years, or even preferably 2 years on corn, 2 years off corn, because then that would enable for first year cornfield not to be at risk and require any BT rootworm hybrids. Second year, possibly more at risk, but through scouting, you can know from the year before if you're going to need root protection, and you could go in with a non-rootworm BT hybrid and use root protection tools, and then leaving the BT rootworm hybrids for that third year, which would be higher risk, before going into a non-corn crop. And so this would mean that the rootworm population is only being exposed to BT rootworms every 4 years. What can you do for 2021? Consider rotating or changing your rootworm management tool for 2021. Watch for signs of resistance and notify us if you do see any potential BT failures so that we have an idea of how extensive this is. There's lots of resources online for you as well. Again, go to Field Crop News. There are videos and articles. And of course, feel free to contact myself directly as well. And so thank you for your time, and I wish you good luck for 2021.
Morning, everyone. As mentioned before, my name is Dennis Coffey from Holmes Agro out of the team in Stainer. I'd like to thank Tracey for her talk on court rootworm and BT resistance. At this time, I'll relay some of the questions that the group had. Just a few coming in through here on text. It looks like rotation is the key to kind of combat this. Tracey, do you know if there's any other traits on the horizon for some seed companies to combat this issue and how it will affect seed cost?
So unfortunately, no, there's not any traits that are coming down the pipeline, and even combinations with RNAi. RNAi is not going to be a sole solution to this. They're already within a year of testing in lab, they found resistance with rootworm to RNAi technology. So they're going to heavily rely on a combination of BT proteins and RNAi. So currently there are no new novel proteins coming. All the 3 out of the 4 cries that are there are so closely related, and they just haven't found anything else. So that's our whole concern now, is that we need to move away from solely relying on BT hybrids to manage rootworm, and we need to rotate any management tool we have, because even just doing corn, soybean will really increase our risk of the rotation variant that knows to lay its eggs in soybeans because corn's coming the next year. So we've got to pay more attention to this pest in particular, because it's been a big problem in the US.
Right. I think that was all the questions that we had come in today. So thanks again, Tracey, for joining us and having that talk with us. Thanks.
Great. Thank you.
Up next, we have Mike Cowbrough, is the weed specialist with Omafra. So looking forward to hear his talks. Take it away, Mike.
I'm Mike Cowbrough with the Ontario Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Rural Affairs, weed specialist in field crops. Let's go over 5 key action items that put your crop at a competitive advantage over weeds. Now, for some of you, at the very least, these strategies will provide assurances that what you're already doing on your farm makes sense. But my hope is that some of you will identify a couple of actionable items that you can make work for this coming season. So let's begin. Action item number 1. Building our base soil fertility levels to 20 parts per million of phosphorus and 120 parts per million for potassium. The name of the game is to harvest as much of the sun's energy as possible. The quicker we can get our crops to close their canopy, the greater the yield potential, the more sun we can harvest. But it also has lots of benefits from a weed control perspective. So let's think about this from the perspective of a weed seed lying near or on the surface of the soil. It wants sunlight and moisture and heat to germinate and grow. This environment down here, if you're a weed seed, pretty amazing. But if you're a weed seed in this environment over here, less than ideal. What you're seeing here is the influence of soil fertility levels on the ability of a soybean crop to canopy. This is work done by Dr. Francois Tardif out of the University of Guelph. And in low testing soil environments, soybean crop was much slower to canopy. In fact, when there was adequate fertility, the crop canopied about 2 weeks quicker than when there was inadequate fertility. And it also intercepted as much as 40% more sunlight. And what that means practically is that's light that's not hitting the soil surface and stimulating the germination of weed seeds. Next up, action item number 2, have a plan to start clean and stay clean. Now, by starting clean, you create an environment where the crops emerge in the absence of weeds. And then by staying clean for a period of time, you will have minimized any significant risk of yield loss from weed competition. Now, in soybeans, that period of time occurs from emergence until the third trifoliate stage of soybeans. Although, as a side note, technically it really starts from the first trifoliate stage of soybeans and then goes to the third trifoliate stage of soybeans. But admittedly, I like to aim for going earlier just because it does give a margin of error in case you're delayed for whatever reason, be it environmental conditions, equipment breakdowns. If we look at timing studies that have been done in, say, Roundup Ready soybeans, is we can maximize yield compared to the weed-free control if we initiate weed control at the beginning of that critical weed-free period. So here, an application of glyphosate at the first trifoliate stage, we have yield that's comparable to the weed-free control, or we could apply a pre-emergent herbicide first, follow up with a late post application of glyphosate, and we also maximize yield. But where we don't want to be is initiating our first pass in the field to control weeds at the third trifoliate stage. In that case, we lose significant yield when we compare it to the weed-free control. But if we look at the level of weed control at the end of the season, a strong argument can be made for using a two-pass system. So going in with a pre-emergent herbicide first, following up with a late post application of glyphosate. Because as you can see, again, in this chart here, that provides us the highest level of weed control, close to perfect weed control by the end of the season. Whereas our single passes of glyphosate early on, although it maximized yield, a significant reduction in weed control compared to the two-pass strategy. And then even a single application of glyphosate at the third trifoliate stage doesn't give us super great weed control at the end of the season. So that's a real benefit if you're wanting to maximize both yield and weed control of using a two-pass system. Now in corn, if we want to minimize yield losses from weeds, we have to keep that corn crop weed-free from emergence until the sixth leaf stage of corn. But if we want to maximize yield and maximize the level of weed control, we need to extend that period of weed control from emergence up into the 8-leaf stage of corn in order to maximize weed control. Action item number 3, invest in crop scouting. Now, whether your farming operation relies on tillage or herbicides to control weeds, the size of the weed at the time of management plays a huge role on how effective you'll be. And over the past 20 years, our perception of what one thinks is a small weed really has changed. You know, if you're using glyphosate, you think a small weed is maybe 20 centimeters tall. But if you're using conventional herbicides, some of those older contact herbicides, a small weed has 4 leaves on it at most, right? So let's look at some common examples of where crop scouting can pay. Let's use common lamb's quarters as an example for the value of scouting. So every year we get complaints about lamb's quarters being poorly controlled, and a lot of good work out of University of Guelph Ridgetown campus has shown, especially with glyphosate, it works best when you can target weeds like lamb's quarters when they're smaller than 10 centimeters. And in fact, if you let them get larger than 10 centimeters, sometimes you have to add as much as 114% more glyphosate to get the same level of control. So to put that in another way, if you use Roundup Transorb to control lamb's quarters and you normally use 0.7 liters per acre, you might have to use 1.4 liters per acre to get the same level of control because that weed has gotten larger than 10 centimeters in height. Weed size is even more critical with conventional herbicides. What you're seeing on the screen here is pigweed, being poorly controlled with an application of Reflex. We see that every year. If we look at the data on level of pigweed control with Reflex, once it gets beyond the 4 to 6 leaf stage, that's where control really diminishes. About a 40% reduction almost in control from going from the 6 leaf stage of pigweed to the 8-leaf stage of pigweed or the 10-leaf stage of pigweed. So scouting, super critical to hit those timing properly. And here's an example where a crop scout found what they thought was water hemp, took it to a diagnostic lab to get it properly ID'd, and also tested for herbicide resistance. Turned out it was water hemp, and it was in fact resistant to 3 different herbicide groups. The good news is that there was only a few plants in this field. They can manage that. Had they not been out scouting and being on top of that, those 10, 20 plants could easily become thousands of plants next season. And it's worthwhile to keep your crop scouting activities focused on looking for water hemp because we're seeing more of it in the province. And almost all of it that was found is resistant to some or multiple herbicide groups, and that presents significant management challenges. So be on the lookout for that in your crop scouting activities. Action item number 4. If you can't grow winter wheat, plant oats. Anytime you can add a crop into your rotation with a different life cycle, it has benefits for weed control. As an example, when was the last time you remember seeing an annual grass in a winter wheat crop? The answer is never. It's not an ideal environment for later emerging summer annual weeds to emerge in. I get it. Not all of you like growing wheat, or it might not be profitable for your operation, and I'm not going to debate that. Rather, if you don't grow winter wheat after soybeans or dry beans, consider planting 50 to 60 pounds per acre of oats. You can blend it with fertilizer, broadcast it, and cultivate it in. It provides quick ground cover to suppress annual weeds from emerging, protects the soil, provides organic matter, and it doesn't overwinter. Just to drive home the point, I want to show you a couple of from the Woodstock Research Station where we were looking at different cereal covers and their influence on weed seed recruitment. And so on the left-hand side, there's barley. On the right-hand side, clearly no barley. And there's a dramatic difference in the level of weed control. Now, I'm cherry picking a photo. This is the nicest looking photo. It doesn't always look this good. But the fact of the matter is that cereals, produce some allelopathic chemicals from their roots that might have some herbicidal properties, especially against certain species. And then secondly, if they're growing quickly, they're up out of the ground early and creating canopy, again, a not hospitable environment for weed seeds to recruit and germinate in. Here's another example of a cereal rye cover crop on the right-hand side. And then, no cereal rye cover on the left-hand side, lots of fleabane in there, some lamb's quarters. Again, adding cereals and even as a cover crop, something as simple as oats in the fall, I think you'll see benefits in terms of reduction of weed seed return to the soil. And finally, action item number 5, control weeds in the fall. I can't say enough good things about managing weeds in the fall, especially the perennial weeds. And so here's an example. This is done by Rennie Van Acker, the Dean of the Ontario Ag College. Fall applied control of dandelions produced significantly fewer dandelions than if you use the same control practice in the spring, right? And we've seen that time and time again. Here's an example of people now pushing that fall application window into November, right? Because that's usually been the grievance is I can make that work after winter wheat, no problems. But what if I'm, got corn and, even this past year, there was a good window in November to get the job done. And it might not look impressive in the fall, but you usually reap the benefits the next spring. Couple more examples here. This is field bindweed. We're not going to get rid of field bindweed with fall applications. We're not going to get rid of perennials with fall applications. I don't want to leave you with that thought, but what it will do is it will drive down the population density. So there'll be less shoots coming out of the ground, and they tend to emerge on the later side. And again, that has value in terms of starting clean and trying to stay clean. So here where we manage to control field bindweed with fall applications, so this is our unsprayed area compared to the rest of the field, and we saw 15% bump in grain yield just from that fall application, because where we didn't spray, it came up earlier and it was competing earlier with the corn crop. If we look at perennial south thistle and soybeans, where it was unsprayed, it got so thick early on that we had to go in and spray earlier than we wanted to. And the benefits of that fall application was about 26% higher soybean yield, simply because that sow thistle came up later and there was less of it. So I can't say enough about fall applications. This little video captures a number of the action items all together that we talked about today. You're looking at part of a field during the first week of May in this past season. It had 50 pounds of cover crop oats blended with potash, broadcast in late August of 2019, a little light cultivation, and then a mid-November application of glyphosate. It looks pretty clean. Compare that to where we did nothing, and it's got tremendous biennial and perennial weed pressure, not a nice environment to plant into the first week of May. So the combination of cover crops with fertilizer, fall weed control, put us in a position where we can start clean and stay clean. And that puts us into a good position going into the spring. If you've made it this far, thanks a lot. I appreciate that. On the screen there is a number of the resources that I've put together to help with weed management. There's my phone number. So if you have any questions, give me a shout. Have a good day.
Thanks, Mike. Those are very 5 insightful action items that we can take into 2021. Just a few questions for you coming in here. How important are water stabilizers or pH adjusters to increase effectiveness of glyphosate?
Yeah, I mean, it's a topic that comes up quite often. Admittedly, I've done no work in it. There's a lot of good work that's been historically done out of North Dakota State University, so I would encourage you to look at that. But generally speaking, we've a little bit looked at pH adjusters and things of that nature. I'm generally in the camp of not needing them. Right. I don't think they add much. When you add glyphosate to water, the pH of the water does go down. I think you also have to be mindful when you're tank mixing it with products like dicamba and 2,4-D. Sometimes when you lower the water pH, you can increase the volatilization of products like dicamba. So I don't want to dismiss the topic because work has been done on it. I think generally speaking, for most of the water that we get in Ontario, it's fine, and the need to adjust pH is largely unnecessary.
Sure. One other one here. Have you done any work with oats providing similar suppression to Canada fleabane as compared to rye as a cover crop situation?
Yeah, we've done a little bit of that work because all cereals crops do have some allelopathic effects. I would say that when we look at Canada fleabane in particular, rye has done a nicer job than oats. But the negative of rye is that you still have to terminate it the next spring, whereas oats, it doesn't overwinter, and so. I wouldn't poo-poo oats. I don't think it's as good as cereal rye, but I think it's a nice gateway cereal cover crop to provide some weed control.
Perfect. Awesome. I think that's all the questions we had, Mike. So thanks for joining us today, and thanks for your talk on those action items that we can take into 2021.
All right. Thank you.
Our final speaker on the Omafra session is Albert Tenuta, field crop pathologist. So can't wait to hear from Albert.
Hello, my name is Albert Tenuta, field crop plant pathologist with Omafra, based out of Ridgetown. And today I'd like to talk to you about what to look for in 2021 when it comes to diseases. The first one is Phytophthora root and seedling blight. As we've been planting earlier, more likely to get cool, wet conditions, which has shown a lot more Phytophthora, especially on compacted clay soils that tend to be poorly drained. But also late season disease as well. And we see the symptoms can occur right up to harvest. And this past year, we saw with those major rain events that caused saturated soils on those heavier clay or more phytophthora prone soils or fields, we saw plants that wilted, they started turning brown, they died. The leaves stayed on them. And if you pulled them up, there were very little root systems attached to those plants. Then if you examined the plants themselves, you would see this dark purple to brown lesion that extends from the soil line up to, say, the second or third node. Very typical of Phytophthora root rot symptoms. So why is it that Phytophthora likes these saturated soils? There's two spore types. Oospores that infect and overwinter in the residue, and they can infect directly, but it's these zoospores. See those little guys swimming around? They've got tails or flagellas, and they'll swim in those soil particles. So those saturated soils, that water film between the soil particles, allow these zoospores to move from one root and infect other ones, and that is key to it. So how do we go about managing or controlling Phytophthora? We start with resistance. In this case, single gene resistance, race-specific resistance. You see those RPS genes that are noted in your seed catalogs. This is very typical of what you would see. So here you've got two varieties. One that we would call resistant, and it's resistant to certain pathotypes, strains, or races of Phytophthora root rot, and another one that is not protected or is susceptible now. And so the problem with this type of resistance, it's either got it or it doesn't have it. And if you have a variant that develops, and we hear a lot about variants in the news right now, that it can bypass that resistance and no longer make it effective. And so we've seen that in the province. Here's some work with Dr. Owen Wally out of Agriculture, Agri-Food Canada out of Harrow, and we've been looking at the populations of Phytophthora across the province and how it reacts to these RPS genes. And you can see some are no longer effective. You know, the RPS 1A7 gene is no longer effective. RPS 1A has been around since the 50s and 60s, and it is no longer effective. And if you see that in the catalog, say an RPS 1A against Phytophthora, it may have that gene, but it's not going to do you any good in Ontario anymore. Some of the newer varieties that have other genes in there have the 1C, 1K there, and that's been around for 20, 25 years. The 1C, you can see up to 50 to 60% or higher now of Phytophthora in the field can take that down. The 1K, we're looking at about 30%. So it's a better, still effective in that. And then if we look at some of the newer genes that are coming out, the RPS 8, not commercially available here yet, but the 3A is, and you can see that those levels are below 20% of our isolates in that. So if you're going to be targeting Phytophthora in the province and you're looking at the genes, more likely the 3A and the 1K are your target right now, but you can tie that in with tolerance. And here is the Phytophthora field tolerance test that's been done at Woodsley at Agriculture, Agri-Food Canada since the mid-70s. And you can see certain varieties here that are showing emerged very well, not showing any disease, and other ones that are not doing very well at all. And so this has been going on for a long period of time, and I do like field tolerance, and that is probably the one aspect that, you know, if you got to pick between those RPS genes and the field tolerance, I think you got to go with the field tolerance. You know, why? Because it makes it's less susceptible to the disease, having the field tolerance in that variety. Doesn't matter what the race or pathotype of Phytophthora it is, disease will develop still, but it will be less severe than what we would have if it didn't have the tolerance or a higher level of tolerance. You want to select a variety with the best tolerance, low plant losses, but remember that weather and environment play an important role. So that will have a factor in there in terms of if it's, you know, cool, wet, 3-4 inches of rain, it's wet for a week, you're going to see some Phytophthora there, but you'll see less than what you would have without it. So, but if you can have both the resistance genes and good field tolerance, that can help, particularly if it's the 1K or the 3A in there. Now, tie that in with seed treatments. And so we have a number of different seed treatments, and the active ingredients, the metal axle M's are the predominant ones we've had over the years. Some newer ones, Intego, Lumicina, those are newer products. And what we've seen is that in combination, where you have one or two actives of either the metal axle M, and then with these other two products in combination, we can start seeing some better control of both Phytophthora and Pythium. And if you're on those heavy clay soils and you've had problems with it, and 1, 2, 3 times, you're replanting in that, supplemental metal axle M or metal axle in that seed treatment, so you're bumping up that rate, is something that more and more people are doing as well. And you're finding the need for that, particularly on those heavy clay soils that have a lot of root rot. How does that play out in the field? Here, if we look at this, we've got a moderate tolerant variety. Compare that to this other variety down below here that has that RPS. Both of these have RPS 1A. The one on your right there has no field tolerance, and then the moderate tolerant one here, you can see we've got a field stand there, but nowhere that we would be happy with. You take that same moderate tolerant variety, you add both the seed treatment plus supplemental seed treatment on top of it, we have a better stand. Still, it's up to it's lowered your risk, but you're still not out of the woods yet there. I think we can do better, and bringing in a good tolerant variety with a good resistance gene, in this particular case, the 1K gene here, this is untreated. You can see just by having those two different types of resistance, we did very well here. Now, if you add that also, and now bring in that seed treatment and supplemental seed treatment, that increased rate, look at that. We've got a much better potential stand, and we've reduced our risk to Phytophthora. And if you look behind there, you can see the variety here that with no the 1A gene, which is no longer effective, poor tolerant variety, and no seed treatment, it's like night and day. So we can use the tools, we got to manage them appropriately as well. Soybean cyst nematode, we know the symptoms above ground. We know stunted plants, yellow areas of the field. We know dead plants. We know poor weed control. All of these symptoms that are associated with many problems, plus soybean cyst nematode. This is what's going on above ground. Hey, what's below ground is that you're seeing these small white to yellow pin-sized cysts that are able to reproduce, and as they reproduce, they are developing and building up higher and higher numbers. It doesn't matter what's going on above ground, the cyst nematode below ground is still going to go about doing its business. You want to keep those numbers as low as possible so that it minimizes yield loss as well. Where are we in cyst nematodes in terms of the province? We saw Simcoe County this year being added. You can see that much of the Southwest, Dufferin, we're still looking for that. Get out there, scout your fields, soil sample your fields, do it yourself, get Homes Agro to do it for you even better, and just find out what your numbers are. Find out if you have cyst nematode, if you don't have cyst nematode. Those numbers will help you evaluate your management tools down in the future as well. So one of those tools is resistant varieties, and resistance starts with the PI 88788. It's in 95% of the varieties out there. P King's in the other 5%. Here's one of our locations here with about 4,000, a moderate cyst pressure, and you can see the susceptible varieties, the yield loss that we see there compared to those two resistant sources. So resistant varieties under cyst nematode pressure pays immensely. Problem is, it's been so successful that now the 88788 source, which is in those 95% of varieties that you have available, is now under pressure, and we're seeing natural populations building up, and particularly, here in Ontario, but really in the US, where in many cases, that source of resistance now, the 88788, is not as effective as it used to be, and it's basically become a susceptible source in those areas. So here's an example in Ontario where that same situation is occurring. This is one of my plots out of the West Elgin area, and you can see these blue arrows. Those are the Peking sources of resistance. This field is adapting to the 88788, and you can see that. You can see that some of these ones, these are our susceptible checks that we have in there, but also these other ones in here, the other strips are the different sources, 88788, and you can see they are nowhere near as effective as they used to be. So the adaptive population is taking a hit on yield. Yields are anywhere from 12 to 45 bushels in those varieties compared to 71 bushels with the Peking. So managing cyst nematode starts with those resistant varieties and those 88788 Peking source. There's a new one, 89722, that's not quite available yet, but hopefully will be available soon. As I said, collect those soil samples, find out what your numbers, those important information, rotate, use your non-host crops, corn, wheat in the rotation. A 3-year crop rotation is better than a 2-year crop rotation. And we're starting to see the use of nematicide seed treatments. They can help us, but they're not silver bullets. They can maybe help us with the populations, and there's many more to come. They're being tested right now as well. So when you got cyst nematode, we inadvertently SDS, sudden death syndrome also follows. And as you can see from the map, it is following the pattern of cyst nematode as well, and it's in your area as well. So if you haven't seen SDS, keep an eye out for these very typical venochlorosis, yellowing, browning of the veins. Those leaves will fall off, and the disease can progress quite quickly, but you can see a lot of that yellowing of the leaves, and usually it's later on in the season that you see it. And so here, again, resistant varieties pay off immensely in both the visual symptoms here we see with the moderate and resistant, highly resistant varieties. We saw, 57 to 63% reduction in foliar symptoms, and on the yield side, we saw a 7.5 to 15% increase in yield as well. So it worked very well. You combine that with seed treatments, and you can see that the resistant variety significantly reduced the foliar leaf diseases, as well as increased yield, in this case 9.5 bushels. Both these trials were in Ontario as well as 5 other US states over multiple years. We saw an 81% reduction of those foliar leaf diseases and a 51% more yield as well. How about tar spot? New disease to Ontario. You see these black tar spot type symptoms here. They're small, what we call stromas. They're raised bumps. They're round, irregular shape. We saw beginning September 21st in the Chatham area. Since then, we saw Essex, Lambton, Elgin, as well as Middlesex by the end of the year having tar spot. It wasn't unexpected. We've been waiting for it. We just had the right environmental conditions this year, and those conditions meant as we got into late August, we got cooler temperatures, wetter conditions, more leaf wetness, more humidity, all that were prime and ready, great conditions for tar spot development. We know tar spot is here now. The risk for us in 2021 will still depend on what's going on in the US, how much inoculum will be there, how early the disease starts, and what the weather conditions will be. So it will more than likely, it will overwinter in Ontario. It is established now. It will continue to spread most likely. It will be very similar to what we see with white mold, fusarium head blight, northern corn leaf blight. It's a disease that we need to be aware of, but we do not need to fear it as well. We can manage it. We can manage it accordingly. And we have much of the tools in place already to deal with this disease. For more information on many of these diseases and others, go to the cropprotectionnetwork.org, Soybean Cyst Nematode Coalition website, as well as the Field Crop Protection Guide. Thank you very much. And if you have any questions, I'd be pleased to answer them. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Albert. So we have a couple questions. The first one, what is more effective way of pest management, using genes and traits of crops, or simply doing a better job with crop rotation and prioritizing with that strategy?
Yeah, so in terms of, the way I always approach it is from a disease standpoint, start with genetics. That's usually been our most effective tool that we have out there. So use the varieties, use the genetics that we have available. If they're not a possibility, we do have some, as I said through the presentation with Phytophthora, soybean cyst nematode, we have other diseases, the fusarium root rots, the pythiums, some of these others, we don't have that genetics. So in that regards, crop rotation is a tool that we could utilize. You know, Tracey showed that as well, and how it can manage other pest problems as well, and Mike as well, and that regards. But for some of these, especially the soil-borne pathogens that live there long, I showed you the image with the Phytophthora and the oospores and those zoospores. They live there for 5-10 years or so. Soybean cyst nematode longer. So crop rotation under those diseases or pathogens that can survive a long time isn't as effective in those shorter ones where it's only a 1 or 2 year cycle as well. So the whole purpose or the whole point is to integrate as many of those management tools as possible to reduce your risk.
Okay, and then I guess to add to that, where would tillage fit into this? Is there certain diseases that tillage is maybe more a better option, or not doing tillage?
Yeah, again, it comes down to the different different pathogens, different diseases are a little different in that regard. So, soybean cyst nematode, for instance, that's one that we've seen where less tillage is beneficial. Not so much that it lowers the numbers per se, but it stops the spread within the field. So if you've got a hot spot that has had cyst nematode in there, and you often will see that yellowing stunting will expand in the direction of tillage, for instance. Other ones, it doesn't per se have an impact. With Phytophthora, we can see some of that, or the water molds, because you're removing, say, some of that moisture or so. So better drainage will assist on those ones. But it can also be a catch-22. For instance, with white mold or sclerotinia, those little rat turds of sclerotia we see on there, they stay on the soil surface, right? So if you've got if you're coming in with a no-till situation, for instance, and you leave those sclerotia on the soil surface, they'll either be UV sunlight, predation, etc. Their survival time is drastically reduced. And so that's great if you're in a 2 or 3 year crop rotation. But if you follow up with soybeans after that, you can actually increase your risk because you've got more of those sclerotia on the soil surface. So you get more spores in there as well.
Okay. And then I guess the last question I have is kind of going back to a part that Mike had, was with fertility levels. Is there anything fertility wise that would help disease tolerance?
Yeah, so in many cases, many of these diseases, they're opportunists, right? So if there's any weakness or any plant stresses, fertility is a big one there. They have, open the door a little bit and they'll make it much wider than you would want as well. So a good healthy plant is often a good opportunity to protect. It's got the ability to protect itself more so than if it was under a more weak condition as well. Soybean cyst nematode is a great example with that, where under and sun death syndrome as well, if the plants are growing vigorously under good fertility conditions or so, or less stressful, it's able to feed itself as well as the nematode. But if you're under stress, the nematode's going to win in that case, the plant's going to lose.
Perfect. Well, I think that's all the questions I have time for right now. So if there's any more questions, we'll get them to you and we'll get you to answer them.
Thank you so much.
No problem. Thank you, Tracey, Mike, and Albert, and for bringing your insights on some key things that we can watch for and implement in 2021.